Obamacare. Is that the #1 thing that should be tackled? Well, House Speaker Ryan today saying that it will be repealed this year, but it won't come cheaply. Some estimates pegging it at as much as $350 billion over the decade. But then we've got, aside from health care, taxes, trade, infrastructure spending. There are a lot of people who say, we know what Ronald Reagan would have thought about these issues or how Donald Trump is tackling them. But guess what? We've got the Harvard professor who actually does know. He is Martin Feldstein. He was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Ronald Reagan, joining us exclusively. A lot of talk about Obamacare. Is that really the first thing that should be tackled?
Well, they've got to start thinking about how they're going to do it, but it's going to be a complicated thing, in part because you've got to get 60 Democrats to sign on for much of it. So taxes really are the thing that they can do this year.
But will they, Martin?
I think they will. I think they will. The House Republicans have been working on this for a long time, and now that the Republicans control the White House and the Senate, I think, and that President Trump has more or less signed on for what the Republicans in the House have been putting together, I think we're going to see that happen.
Everybody loves tax cuts. It's like when you're running for student body president, you say bubble gum and lollipops for all. Who wouldn't want that? However, you pair it with a big spending bill. Donald Trump has said $1 trillion infrastructure plan. You're an economist. You have to tell me if that is really going to work to spur the 3 to 4% growth this country has been waiting for. Or does it blow up the deficit?
Well, I think if you just did that, it would increase the deficit in a worrying way. But I think the infrastructure $1 trillion, I don't think that's going to happen. And the tax cut, it depends on how it's done. But the corporate tax rate cut, we've been waiting for 30 years for any kind of fundamental reform, and all we've done over these 30 years is increase taxes. I think if this is done right, including the so-called border tax adjustment, the corporate tax rate reduction will not be very expensive. I think the personal side remains to be seen, but I think we're going to have to do more than just cut taxes if we want to avoid a rising budget deficit.
Well, there you are. You've got to cut the spending. Let me bring it back to the man with whom you worked, and that was Ronald Reagan, who managed to brilliantly figure out how to cut taxes, but also to stimulate growth and not blow up the deficit. Is Donald Trump in that same form as Ronald Reagan?
Well, Ronald Reagan had an advantage. When we started, we were in a deep, deep hole. And so just coming out of the hole led to very substantial growth and very substantial revenue.
Are you saying that we're not in a deep hole, that President Obama managed to, over the past 8 years, figure out a way to at least scratch out of some of that?
Well, I wouldn't say he did. I would say the Fed gets most of the credit for it. But we're at essentially full employment now. In 1982, when I joined the Reagan administration, the unemployment rate was nearly 11%, more than twice what it is now. And during the next 8 years, well, it came down from nearly 11% to a little over 5%. So that produced 4% real growth, and that produced a lot of extra tax revenue. But, you know, Ronald Reagan was not afraid to slow the growth of Social Security. The 1983 Social Security legislation said, well, with a lag, with a delay, and very gradually, we will start to raise the retirement age from 65 to 67. And that's what the legislation did. But now here we are, 40 years later, and the average life expectancy for somebody in their 60s has gone up by another 3 years.
And that worries people because they're living longer and they need to have more retirement. But let me finish by asking you, if Donald Trump is standing at the door of what he really wants to do, it's Congress that holds the key. Ronald Reagan was brilliant at using his humor and at using his ability to bridge gaps. He worked so well with Tip O'Neill. Do you see that? Do you see that with Donald Trump crossing bridges to the other side of the aisle?
As you said, Ronald Reagan had to do it without a Republican majority in the House. He never had a Republican
But
majority
Donald
in
Trump's
both
arguing
houses.
with some of his own party at this point.
Yes, but on the tax thing, they're not going to argue about anything other than detail. I think we're going to see the House Republican tax bill go through the House, go to the Senate, and eventually end up being signed by the president.
Well, heck, the Dow should be skyrocketing right now if that were the case, because that would be good for stocks. Martin, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Martin Feldstein, former top economic advisor to Ronald Reagan. We